Alright, to do the numbers 0 through 20, we're going to start with zéro, zéro. Then we have un, un. This can sometimes be une, as we've heard before. We had c'est un ami and c'est une amie. Un is typically the one we use for counting, but on occasion, when we're talking about feminine things, we will use une. It's important to know for sentences, but not necessarily for counting. For counting, like I said, we'll always stick to un. Zéro, un, deux, deux, trois, trois. Remember our OI makes a wa sound. And note that I don't really say the R that much. Trois. It's there a little bit, but we could just kind of hit it and move on. Trois. You'll even hear some French people say toi and ignore the R altogether. Un, deux, trois, quatre. Also sometimes quatre. Depending on both the sentence, okay, a lot of times in the middle of speaking a long sentence, we'll just stick to quatre and move on in order to preserve the flow of the sentence. But it's also somewhat a dialectal issue. Just like we have with au revoir and au revoir, people further north are more likely to say quatre versus people south are more likely to say quatre. Un, deux, trois, quatre, cinq. Cinq. Before we go on, it's important to note that when we are counting on our fingers, we count in a different order than we do in English. In English, when we count, we often begin with our index finger. Count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The thumb is last on number 5. In France, and in fact in much of Europe, we begin counting on our thumb. So our thumb is really un, deux, trois, quatre, cinq. It's a very important distinction, as many people in France will hold up their index finger alone, the way that we would signify one, to mean that they want two of something. So it can lead to some very amusing conversations. If you hold up your pointer finger to mean one, and then the person to whom you're speaking thinks that you mean two, it can be very confusing. So remember, un is always going to be your thumb. Un, deux, trois, quatre, cinq. After that, we'll add six. Six. Yes, they are spelled the same, but no, they are not pronounced the same. Six. Sept. Sept. Notice we're more or less skipping that P entirely. Huit. Huit. There's no H pronounced at the beginning of words. Huit. Neuf. Neuf. And dix. Dix. So the whole thing we have zéro, un, deux, trois, quatre, cinq, six, sept, huit, neuf, dix. Most people will ever only learn it in that order because we learn to count that way. However, when you think about real life, we typically don't use numbers in exactly the order that we count them in. So, in order to practice using numbers out of order as well, we're going to do some simple math problems. 5 plus 3 font what? So 5 plus, just the way it looks, 3 font, it makes. So what does 5 plus 3 equal? 8. 5 plus 3 equals 8. 5 plus 3 font 8. Let's try another. 2 plus 7 font 2 plus 7 font 9. 2 plus 7 makes 9. Alright, let's try to add on the rest of the numbers up to 20. You'll note that for 11 through 16, there are some vague similarities to 1 through 6. 11 will add 11. 11. Note that we have a little bit of similarity here with un. We went from un to on and added a ze. All of these from 11 to 16 will end in ze. It's kind of the French version of saying teen at the end of one of these letters. 11. 12. You can kind of sort of hear the word de. De becomes 12. 13. 13. Note that it is actually important to say the R here. We go from trois to 13. Much, much more emphasized. 11, 12, 13, 14. 14. Note that we actually have the opposite of 13 here. 13 we made absolutely positively certain to hit that R, and on 14 we kind of pretend it doesn't exist. That's because the French R and a French Z are practically impossible to pronounce next to each other. 14. It's much, much easier. We have to remember it's there when we spell it, of course. But it's much easier just to focus on pronouncing the ZE. 14. Even in northern France, they typically just stick to 14. So we have 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. 15. This one is typically the hardest one for people to remember because it has little to nothing in common with 5. 15. I always remembered it as a student because it sounded to me like the word can, like a soda can. Cans. Not sure why I had 15 soda cans, but it worked for me. After cans, we have 16. We can hear a bit more of a similarity here again. So we have 6 becomes 16. For 17, 18, and 19, though, we're going to drop this construction entirely and just say, 10 plus 7. Quite literally. 17 is 17. We have a 10. We're going to connect it together with a 7. That hyphen is pretty much saying, we're going to take 10, throw it together with 7, and we make a 17. 17. The exact same thing for 18 and 19. 17, 18, 19. We have a completely different word, however, for 20. So for 20, we're going to say 20. 20. It sounds almost like the English word van, like a van that you drive, but it's a nasal sound. 20. So let's run through this entire thing. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Alright, let's try some more math. If we have 11 plus 3 font 14. 11 plus 3 makes 14. Let's try another one. 15 plus 5 font 20. 15 plus 5 makes 20. Let's make this a little bit harder. Take away your reference. 10 plus 6 font 16. 10 plus 6 makes 16. How about 12 plus 5 font 17. 12 plus 5 equals 17. One more. What's 14 plus 1 font 15. 14 plus 1 makes 15. If simple addition is not your thing, another good way to practice is to count in patterns. So, for example, if I want to count by even numbers only, I'd say 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. What comes next? 12, 14, 16, 18, 20. This is another good way to practice numbers in ways that we actually use them in real life. You don't want to be stuck having to count up to a number every single time you want to say it. If you want to say 15, for example, you shouldn't have to pull out your fingers and whisper 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 until you get all the way up to 15. You have to learn them all independent of each other. So patterns and simple math is a good way to practice that.